Good morning and happy Sabbath, everyone. Pray that you are all feeling refreshed this morning. Um, Before we begin, we can start with a word of prayer. So please join me as we open. Dear God, thank you as always for the opportunity to meet, discuss ideas. As we draw closer to the Sunday law and we try to navigate um, the complex issues in our history, I pray that you may shine a light on the things that we have learned so that they can reflect back into our consciousness and we're able to sift sources of information, sift what is right and wrong, so that we may adopt correct positions and be able to see the things that bring about the Sunday law test in our history. And I pray, thanking you for your continual guidance on that journey. Um, May this study be a blessing to us and to myself as well. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So today's study is going to be a continuation and somewhat summation of the last, I think, 3 or 4 so Vesper studies that we've been going through together. And if anyone has not been following those, then hopefully you'd be able to still get something from today's study. And if not, and you'd like a bit more detail into some of the things that myself or anyone else just says as fact after having gone through them, then please feel free to revisit some of those studies. But for today, as I said, the hope and intention is that we're able to come to a conclusion as to what we've been trying to understand, or if I can say, weed out, so to speak. So in my prayer, I mentioned the fact that we're living in a history where things are complex, and I think each of us can attest to that fact. That I'll just use the conflict between Israel and Palestine as being one of those issues. And questions arise, is this a matter of compromise from the Democratic Party in wanting to achieve their objectives, but funding Israel no matter the consequences, despite what the Israeli government are doing to Palestinian citizens? Is it an issue of compromise, or is it an issue of correctly identifying whether America should be involved or not? Is this a paleo-conservative where the far left are aligning with paleo-conservative ideals? What's going on? What position is the right position? What should we be taking from the events that are unfolding? That's just one topic or aspect of political events or foreign policy that we can look at and say, okay, things are complex. How do we decipher what's going on in the great controversy perspective? And so, in trying to unravel that complexity and break it down into smaller parts, we started off at least by looking at where we are in this Earth's history, where we are on the reform lines. And you would give me a moment to share my screen. Sorry. In looking at our reform lines, we recognized and do recognize, sorry, Emma, please could you admit that? We recognize that we're within, hello, sorry, what was that?
Leave it on. Sorry, that's okay. We're just keeping the mic on.
Okay. We recognize that we're in this time period between Panium and the Sunday Law. And I spent quite a fair amount of time trying to point out the fact that between 2001 and the Sunday Law, there's this, or at least prior to establishing Raphia and Panium, there was this big gap between these two major waymarks. And so it becomes a necessity for us to fill in that gap. And one of the ways that information is put on that line and that gap is populated is through fractals, by understanding the repeating structure and the fractal nature of our lines, where priests, Levites, and Nethinims have smaller waymarks in between big waymarks that help this story progress, help us navigate this story that lead us up to the Sunday Law. And an important aspect of that is that despite the absence of waymarks between Panium and the Sunday Law on the line of the 144,000, there's still things going on. It may not be for priests, it may on the line of the priests at least, because that's concluded, and it may not be on the line of the 144,000, but there's these two waymarks on the lines of the Levites and the Nethinims that if you take it at a progressive story, they exist between 2021 and the Sunday Law, and they would be identified as an increase of knowledge and a formalization. And so at least my studies had started off by trying to answer the question, okay, if those lines do exist, if those waymarks do exist, sorry, and they relate to the Levites and the Nethinims, then what are they? What could they be, at least? And how do we go about identifying it? What's the nature of an increase of knowledge? What's the nature of a formalization? We can look back at past increases of knowledge and formalizations to get indications of what we can expect. And so these two waymarks relate. Yeah.
Could I just ask a question? Sorry to interrupt you. Mm-hmm. In your introductory thoughts, you mentioned about what's happening in Israel at the moment. When I say Israel, I mean Gaza, West Bank, etc. And you used the word "it's complicated." Could you just clarify for me what's complicated? Is it mm-hmm. to do with these waymarks that you're speaking of, that prophetically there's some complexity, or is the complexity about how people are behaving or how they should behave in response to the events that are happening? What's the complexity? Is it a moral complexity or a prophetic complexity, or both? I'm not sure what you meant by the term "it's complicated."
I think I was pointing to the latter of what you referred to, is how people are meant to be relating to the events that are taking place. At what lens should they be, or we should be looking at them from? What should we be trying to identify? I think that's the aspect that I was coming from, and that will come into discussion when we go through a bit later.
So if I could just summarize, when you use the word complicated, you're not saying people's behavior is so complicated that we can't understand what's right and wrong. You're saying what's complicated is this struggle that's going on there. Does it have prophetic significance? And if so, what is that significance? Because it's a bit more complicated than we may have imagined. Is that what you mean by complicated?
Yeah. Yes. So I'm pretty sure that most people could look at what Israel is doing, for instance, or how they've gone about retaliating against those attacks and looking at them as morally morbid, or looking at the attacks of Hamas and calling that out. So people can generally attest to the fact that what's occurring is bad, but the complications come in terms of, in the prophetic narrative, what relevance does it have in this story between Panium and the Sunday Law? Does it have prophetic significance? Are there markers or cues that we should be able to identify in that story of prophetic significance?
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So with that in mind, I'd just like to set a bit of context, and that's one piece of context, that these two waymarks exist on the lines of the Levites and on the lines of the Nethinims as increases of knowledge and formalizations of messages, either for the Levites between their close of probation and the second advent, or for the Nethinims between their Sunday law and their close of probation. A harvest, what should be a harvest, and a latter rain, respectively, for those respective groups. Another piece of context that I'd like to put into the story is that there's something else going on in this history, which is taken, or at least we can understand it under the framework of the agitation of the Sunday law. And we get that reference from GC 605, paragraph 3. Where Ellen White, I'll read it. It's a very short paragraph. It says, heretofore, those who presented the truths of the third angel's message have been regarded as mere alarmists. Their predictions that religious intolerance would gain control in the United States, that church and state would unite to persecute those who keep the commandments of God, have been pronounced as groundless and absurd. It has been confidently declared that this land could never become other than what it has been, the defender of religious freedom. She's essentially saying that the third angel's message is pointing out that a time will come where the United States is going to attack religious freedoms. And the people have looked at that message and said that will never happen. So that's all she's setting up in those first 3 sentences. But as the question of enforcing Sunday observance is widely agitated, so as it's being discussed in the public sphere and people can see it approaching, the event so long doubted and disbelieved, what she set up in those first few sentences, is seen to be approaching, and the third angel's message will produce an effect which it could not have done before, because it's now being able to be seen in the public sphere. We recognize that this is set in a context of a Sunday Sabbath or Sunday issue. But when we read it with regards to a human rights issue, specifically women's rights issue, we can see the same dynamic playing out. So this is in that context. If we can flip some of the words in that paragraph to reflect our present day message of human rights and women's rights, we would recognize that the truths of our message, or as well as in the public, that a time will come when the United States will speak as a dragon and overturn or change its face to being an attack of human rights as opposed to a defender of human rights, has been laughed off. It's been proclaimed as people just being fanatical. But now, whenever this time period is of agitation, of a point when the United States will attack human rights approaches, more will be able to be seen that this is going to happen. And so it should gain a lot more footing in people's consciousness. So the question is, when does this agitation begin? And begin to lead up to the Sunday law. A hand's gone up.
Sorry, Curtis. I want to go back to my question. You said the complexity wasn't moral, it was prophetic. So I got that. Mm-hmm. But in that introductory statement, you said something about the United States, and I think you mentioned Biden, but you mentioned about compromise and the United States behavior, if we call it a war, the war that's going on in Israel. What's that with respect to our understanding or our perspective of the prophetic complexity? What's the compromise of the United States to do with that? Because that to me sounded like the United States is compromising morally between those two belligerents. And I didn't understand the context if it's a prophetic complexity. What the American compromise is. Is that mean we don't understand what they're doing, or they don't understand what they're doing?
So in that statement, I set up 2 scenarios One is a scenario where people look at how the United States is behaving and see it as, oh, Democrats are compromising against their principles. So that's one scenario. Another scenario is America we'll say, getting in bed with Israel, is doing the right thing by intervening in a situation that sees human rights under threat. The question is, whose human rights are under threat? And is it an issue of compromise, or is it an issue of America intervening, and it should be intervening or shouldn't be intervening? I haven't answered that question. I haven't stated what my position is, but it's just setting up. The complication is being able to recognize, is it one of those two aspects, or is it a different aspect in a prophetic sense?
When you say people, you mean us?
Viewers in the movement, in the world.
We don't care what the world is thinking, do we? We care what we're thinking, because the complexity is our prophetic understanding, because the world doesn't even have a prophetic understanding.
I would suggest it's both. And the reason why I suggest it's both is because for us in the movement, everything is, we see it on a prophetic structure. For the world, going back to our lines, and by the world, I'm clumping in Levites and Nethinims in that story, if you'd allow me. It's pointing out the fact that these two waymarks, or this time period, exist on their structures. So in the same way that with past events in 2014 or in 2021 with America pulling out of Afghanistan, the world needed to look at politics and be able to decipher what the right true stream of information is in those agitations or those conflicts.
Could I summarize that point this way? If tell me if you agree. Yeah. The world, and I understand you're saying Levites and Nethinim, everybody except us, the world, they will look at what's going on, and you're focusing on Israel in this conversation, and they will make a moral position of that, not a prophetic one. But that moral position ends up affecting their prophetic position in the great controversy. So even though they don't have an awareness of the prophecy, which means they're not outsiders viewing this issue, they're participating in it, their response places them, if we can say, on the right or wrong side of prophecy or salvation, perhaps, if that's a real thing for them. And so even though it's purely moral for them, it has a prophetic significance. But when we look at it, we also have that same problem, that the way we view it morally affects our prophetic standing. But we have an additional layer that they don't, that the Bible says we're ambassadors, and they're not ambassadors. They're actors in the play. They're not the audience. And we are both. Is that how when you say that it affects them as much as it does us? Because we're both actors, we and they, which means morally and then with a prophetic significance. But we have another role. These lines of people are an audience that are observing a play acting out, and they're not even part of that. So there's that. Is that a fair summary of what you've said and what you're thinking is?
Yeah, precisely. And I think that can be demonstrated when we look at the agitation of the Sunday Law as a whole as well. What is the agitation of the Sunday Law, and who is it being agitated by? I think that we can recognize that the world has no true formalization of the Sunday Law as a waymark. We know that. But they recognize that morally, we'll say within America, something is off. Something is not right in terms of the direction that the United States is going. How that affects, as you put it, salvation or the great controversy, they have no awareness of. What we are able to do as observers and participants is take their observations of events that are happening in the world and put it on a line, we'll say, and attach prophetic significance to everything that's transpiring. So that's just to agree with your summation,
Thank
really. So the question is, when does this agitation begin? Or at least I asked the question, when do we envisage this agitation as beginning? And if we can see that this Sunday law as occurring on the line of the 144,000, and my suggestion is that the agitation begins at the formalization on that line for the Sunday law. And the reason why I have that suggestion is because of the nature of fractals. When we look at the line of the priest and up here, and we zoom in at the line of the priest, and 2014 being that Sunday law waymark, and we look back at the formalization that preceded the Sunday law waymark, being 2012, and we asked the question, okay, in that formalization, one, what was being formalized and what were the elements of that formalization? And without going into the details of that, we appreciate and point out that the 126 is the understanding of the 2520 and the 126 were components of that 2012 message as it related to an approaching Sunday law, 2012. Externally, we can look at all the prophetic markers that occurred in 2012 within the Republican Party that set up what then went on to become the cleansing of the judicial and legislative branch and all that to do with Mitch McConnell. But there's aspects of 2012 externally that set up 2014, and there's a recognition internally that something is coming in a few years' time. So there's this relationship between the formalization and the Sunday law. So in this regard, when we look at the formalization on the line of the 144,000, we have to see a relationship between the two. It's formalizing a message that leads you up to the Sunday law. It's, if we think of Paul in the story of Acts 27, this is Acts 27, verse 27, where he's now saying where, I can't remember the metrics, but we're X meters up until we hit shipwreck. And we line that up with Panium, respectively.
Could you zoom out to the full page, please?
Mm-hmm.
On the
this is just zoom in on this time period.
On the 144,000 line, you've not put those two waymarks in between the major waymarks on at every single place. I don't have you.
On this one, I haven't. In past studies, I only put these two here because I wanted our focus to be here. But I would suggest, as I have done in past studies, that these smaller waymarks are just filling in gaps in between that story, appreciating that they don't relate to the 144,000 in the same way that 2001, Raphia, Panium do, but they're all part of the story that takes you from 1989 up until the Second Advent. That's my suggestion, at least.
Raphia and Panium are in blue. I presume that means that they're not major waymarks.
Yes. Yeah.
So on that line of the 144,000, where would you mark the agitation there? The great controversy quote. On that line, where would it be marked?
That's what I was getting into here. So as Panium and the Sunday law.
I'm just wondering if you can do it on that top line.
Yeah, sure.
Would you still mark it in the? I guess that. Oh, so you'd mark it in the blue.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Using 2012 as we'll say witness or logic, yeah.
Because you're saying Panium is the formalization
between 2001 and the Sunday law.
Okay.
That's not to be confused with this formalization. It's not the same thing. If you can appreciate that.
Same thing as in two different waymarks.
This formalization is not the same as what this formalization is.
Yes, in the same sense that the waymark just preceding Panium, that small tick you put in, that is
Yes.
also a formalization, and that's not the same formalization as Panium. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So with that backdrop, if we can appreciate that this time period, I would see the agitation of the Sunday Law as going on from this point, from where it begins, and it's just an increasing of intensity, and it doesn't stop at the Sunday Law. It increases in intensity up until the close of probation, for argument's sake. And the reason why it doesn't stop at the Sunday Law is because from the point at which the Sunday Law occurs, there's still, we'll say by external actors, there's still criticisms or observations being made as to the direction in which America is going or has gone, so to speak. And so it's our duty to identify what the observers are identifying, and at the increase of knowledge and formalization, tie the prophetic significance of what the observers are seeing and what we understand in the Great Controversy to the loud cry and the increase of knowledge, respectively.
Could I don't know if you're summarizing, but maybe this isn't. You've got in that picture 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You've got 7 waymarks from Panium to close the probation. And the way you've done the agitation line, I don't know if you're indicating that the agitation would end at the close of probation. And if that's the case, are you suggesting that the 6 waymarks, which is Panium to, I'm going to call it, I don't know which, between Sunday and close, but I don't know which one is the loud cry. I guess it's the formalization. So between Panium and the loud cry, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 6 waymarks, which would be 6 historical events. And each one of those events are markers of an agitation that's happening that is escalating in severity. So there would something happen at Panium to mark an agitation, something happened at the increase of knowledge and the formalization, etc., etc. Is that what that artwork is
Demonstrating?
Yes.
And as that, as you said, the intensity gets stronger and stronger until it's, if I can say it this way, out in the open. It's clearly visible. It's more loud spoken about.
What is the it?
The aspects of the Sunday Law. What it is that America tramples on, we'll say, human rights. It no longer becomes a defender of human rights as it relates to women's rights specifically.
So the it is human rights. Okay.
Women's rights.
Okay, so I'll just leave it human rights.
Okay.
And the reason I wanted to say that, you keep it at that level, is because some of these perhaps aren't about women.
Yeah, fine, sure.
Because some of the legislation isn't directly to do with women. If we think about what's happening in Florida, for instance, with respect to the banning of certain books connected to the issue of racism and critical race theory, for it as an example. So you said at some stage it becomes clear or visible. Is that what you said?
Clearer. I'm pretty sure that there will be elements or people who still don't recognize it. But it's just to point out that this intensity is increasing.
Without saying Roe versus Wade is one of those waymarks, is Roe versus Wade the issue of abortion right? Is that now like people can see it? It's visible. It's there to see, as an example.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, could we say that women's rights are the primary Sunday Law? for saying there's human rights, there's many different legislations going on, but could we say that gender is the primary law, like the Fugitive Slave Act?
I think that the Sunday Law, as historically, composes of multiple things. As a waymark, as with every waymark, we attach many different events because it's a period of time. And just like 2014, it was more than just how it related to women's rights or feminism or LGBTQ. It was America's relationships with China. It was China's foreign policy. As Alpamander stated, it's the racial dynamic within America. So there's many components of the Sunday Law waymark. There's a second dynamic or second aspect of that is when we look at the test. So there's the test, if I can say the moral test, which is a prophetic test. And then there is the waymarks that constitute that, or the events that constitute that test. So if I could say that the test has to do with women's rights or gender, but the events all bring you to a point that composes that test. Does that make sense, Natalie?
Mm-hmm.
Curtis, can I ask you something?
Sure thing.
You were mentioning when you said that the agitation begins in Panium, you referred to the logic of 2012 and 2014.
Mm-hmm.
I think I kind of missed that. How does that help us to put the agitation in Panium?
It was referring to the relationship between a formalization that precedes a Sunday Law. In 2012, where is it? In 2012, externally, we can identify we'll say the movements within the Republican Party to set up the stage for them purging the judicial legislative branches from 2014 onwards. So externally, there's that aspect that in 2012, for the people who can see it, can recognize that something is taking place within America that's leading up to an event that's going to happen. Internally, there's the studies done on the 126 and the 2520 that are saying in 2014, there's going to be a Sunday Law. So it's this identification that things are taking place that bring you to the Sunday Law in a very summarized manner.
Curtis,
could
I just follow up with that point? I don't know if I'm putting words into Andreas's mouth. One second. If we were to compare what you've got on the screen now, Panium to Sunday Law, and if we were to go back to the line of the priest, which would Panium be 2001? And obviously the Sunday Law would be the Sunday Law. Would that mean that the agitation would begin in 2001, but you're marking 2012 because that's what this study is about, where you've got on the line 144, you had formalization, you underline that that's the waymark that is the important one in this story that you're developing. Would it have the same pattern that we'd begin the agitation at 2001? Often we might call that the beginning of the third woe, or when we see what events happen in 2001, we know that the Sunday Law issue is being kicked off, can you say it that way, which would then kind of, I'm wondering if that's part of what Andreas's question is. Maybe it isn't.
I would suggest that the relationship between 2012 2014 isn't the same as the relationship between 2001 and the Sunday Law, because they're different types of waymarks. So as we can see here, the 2012 was a formalization of the message of 2001. So it's a minor waymark, if we can call it that, in that dispensation. And then over here on the line of the 144,000, as I wrote it in blue, is to indicate that it's not one of those 5 major waymarks. It's a formalization. And I think we point to Panium as the formalization in the dispensation of 2001 and the Sunday Law. So here, this is one dispensation, and the zoomed out or bigger type of that is this 2001 to the Sunday Law.
Okay,
so Panium is the same as 2012.
Got it.
In nature. So, with that being said,
did I answer the question, Andreas?
Yeah, I think so, but I still like, so if in the sense that it began in the agitation of no, I think I need to think about it a little bit more. Yeah.
Is there something in particular that doesn't make sense?
And I'm not saying it
perhaps
doesn't
try
make
to
sense.
answer better.
Yeah, so I think I kind of got lost a little bit. Not that it doesn't make sense, but that I couldn't follow that well.
Okay, I will another time try to explain that in a bit more detail, just to allow me to make a bit more progress.
Yeah.
Curtis, there is a question in the chat. Well, I guess it's a question, and Brian's put, but what does it matter what we think as mere bystanders in the unfolding events when we, as has been suggested before, are not taking this message publicly? I'm confused.
Can I choose not to answer that? Because
sure. And Charity has.
If the questions are specific to what I'm trying to point out, I'll answer them, just because I would like to try and conclude the study today. So, Charity, is your message specific to this?
You can decide.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm asking her to state it.
Okay, I had raised my hand on the issue of the Sunday Law. There's a time you're speaking to Elder Parminder about the Sunday Law and the issues concerning the Sunday Law. I don't know if it's okay for me to make a comment or you want to continue with your study.
You can ask your question and then I'll, as I said, decide.
Okay, so I'm not sure what Elder Parminder was saying, but when you were speaking about the issue to do with the Sunday Law being to do with a whole lot of different issues as opposed to just the issue of gender, it just took me back to the Eden to Eden model and how we have understood that God is basically leading the world or humanity to a point where we understand the issue of gender better, because that's like the original sin. And in my mind, I was just thinking all the issues that are occurring in the agitation of the Sunday Law, whether it's got to do with race and all the other different things. I thought personally that it's got to do with how God is leading humanity to a point where they can ask certain questions that would eventually lead us to a point where we understand where the issue of sin began and how we need to understand that original sin to do with sexism and gender. And I believe that's why the issue of gender is the test for our time. So I'm just basically saying, in as much as there's all these other different things that are happening to do with human rights, in my mind, I'm seeing how God is leading us to that first sin. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for pointing that out. So,
Curtis,
final question.
I don't know, like,
final question.
Okay. So now I was just thinking about that. So like I don't know if it answered, like, in the sense of, so what I was saying is the dispensation of 2001 to 2014. So it begins in 2001, then you have 2009, and then 2012, and then 2014. And if we take the dispensation of 2001 to the Sunday law, and we are putting that in, we're putting that in parallel, then if we say that the agitation begins in 2012, then in the line of 2001 to the Sunday law, it would begin in Panium. But in the sense of like what, so if we only look at the 2014 dispensation, so I understood the point that like there's some things happening about in 2012 that point to 2014.
Externally.
Externally. But the thread of that line also like starts in 2001 because it's like it has to be like a continuous story in that sense.
So No, carry on. Sorry.
So we are marking the agitation because it's kind of like a formalization and everyone could see it then. Is that what you're saying?
In an ideal world, everyone sees it, or we'll say that's how, yeah, everyone sees it. But it's when we went through those studies, I think it was last week or the week before, of what a formalization is and what it's meant to do. There were two aspects that we brought out. One is that this message, as you're saying, if we go back to 2001, that arrives in 2001, is finally put in a package and highlighted to a point where people can now be held accountable to it. So prior to that, we'll say it's the same message, but at this point of the formalization, God is expecting the people who see it to now be held accountable to it where they couldn't before, because they have enough information to make an informed decision, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I understood it now.
Okay. So, that as an introduction, we'll begin the question of what is this increase of knowledge that we expect to be taking place between Panium and the Sunday law. And for a couple of classes, we went through Aldertes's studies, specifically at the tail end of those Vespers studies, pointing out that it's bookended by two specific studies. One was called Navigating the Complex, and the last one was a summation of everything that had occurred for the past few months. And that end, I'm just going to put the date of what occurred at that point. It was June 24, 2022, where she did a study which went through the necessity of sifting the left wing. And if I can say, going back to what lines are intersecting between Panium and the Sunday law, it's the Levites and the Nethinims. The priest line has come to a close, and the Levites are now being harvested, should be harvested, and it's the latter rain for the Nethinims. And if you can take your minds to the study of Acts 27 and the studies done on change of leadership, when looking at the counterfeit and all that, we recognize that it's at Panium where the world should be under new leadership, even though they can't see it, being the movement. And when the world starts being harvested, who are those that are being harvested? Is it conservatives? Is it liberals? And we would say that it's got to a point after all these successive waymarks that it's those on the left that are being sifted out at this point. And so what is going to do that sifting out of the left wing come the harvest of the Nethinims and the harvest of the Levites in their respective geographies? And so we start questioning, why do we need to sift them? Are there problems within the left as a whole? And I'll say three key components of all of those studies that we've identified was, number one, that there's two differing ethos between the left wing and the right wing. One is, as they relate to equality and freedom, is what's prioritized when freedom and equality come head to head. The second was that this is more than just a religious issue that's taking place within America. It's cultural as well. And I think that the parable or the analogy that Al-Parminder gives of two sides of the same coin, being religious and cultural, point to what's taking place, identify the nature of how society is changed. Is it changed from religious groups, or is it changed by how people interact? Both. There's this symbiotic nature between how society's worldviews are shaped. So why is it important to see it as a cultural issue and not solely as a religious issue? Is pointing out the pervasive nature of how equality is undermined to the expense of individuals' freedoms. There are two components to radical feminism. If we can, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add a point that's been on my mind for a while, and I guess this is recorded, so I thought I wanted to just put it in here. I've spoken. You mentioned about two sides of the same coin, etc., and they both do the same thing. One of the things that's been on my mind for a while now is the reason why they're both problematic or dangerous, culture and religion, is because they both use the same technique to exploit human nature. They both understand our construction, and they use methods which are identical to each other to come into our lives and basically manipulate us to do their bidding. And that's why they end up being the same thing. So there's no safety in the world, and there's no safety in religion, because both of them will exploit your weaknesses, and they use the identical techniques to do that. That's why someone who got into a January 6th ditch is in serious trouble, and they got manipulated, and they're just patriots. In the same way that we could say conservative Adventists are also in a ditch, and the ditch is the same one. So, for instance, if I don't say Adventists, if I say Protestants, and you mentioned about compromise and Americans, part of the reason why, and I think it's been discussed, they view Israel in the way they do is because of their religious perspectives. So religion has manipulated them into behaving the same way as a secular government would behave towards Israel. They're all doing the same thing because of this manipulation. I just wanted to put that point in. Thanks.
If I could ask you a question to clarify one thing, is you said that both religion and culture use the same techniques to manipulate human psyche. Could you elaborate on what those techniques are and what that manipulation looks like, or how it manifests?
One of the things about human beings, when we speak about point one, equality and freedom, often we speak about these as two concepts, external forces that come upon us, and selfish people choose, I guess, freedom, and nice people choose equality. So it's, depending on which choice you're going to make, you'd be a good person or a bad person, a saved or a lost person. But I think the reality is every human being actually is constructed to have both elements. It's built into us. And using a different framework, I would have used the word fast brain, slow brain. Fast brain is defense. Slow brain is is more reasonable, is something that is more relationship based, if I can say it that way. There's probably not a really good definition. And the manipulation, one of the things that we get manipulated on because it's part of our construction, is that we don't want to be on our own. We don't want to be lonely. We want to be part of a group. That's how the Tower of Babel works. That's how the boat's made. That's how the disciples, everything's built upon this idea of being part of a community. And religion exploits that. It exploits our need to be part of something, as does culture. That's, you know, the boys club, the January 6th, all of that. You want to be part of something. That's what patriotism is. And when we say we're not part of this, we're in the world, we're not of the world, we're ambassadors. We just do the same thing. We want to enter into the kingdom of heaven. We want to be baptized into that kingdom. We're only part of a group. And that's one of them. It's not the only one, but that's one of the things we get exploited on, our desire to be part of something. And what it does, it ends up making us, I'll use the word compromise, or actually not be honest. So something that's come out over the last few years is women in this movement have said, I never wanted to wear skirts. I always liked trousers or pants. And then the question is, well, why did you never complain? And they'll say, I never complained because I wanted to be part of the group. I got manipulated because the group was so important to me. I was willing to, I'll say the word compromise, on my true belief of what I actually wanted. So the tension between equality and freedom there. So I think one of the major things we get manipulated on is we want to be part of something. It's not the only one, but I'll just stop with that one.
Okay. Thank you. That makes sense. And so when viewing that, just going on along that thought, one of the things that came out of looking at this contention between an individual's freedom and, we'll say, the group, and where compromises should, or where compromises are made, or where retaliation against what the group wants are made, is we see it manifested within libertarian circles, if we can call it that. In its purest sense, the ideology of we'll come to a collective, uniform, peaceful solution if individuals just act good. I know I'm oversimplifying that definition of libertarianism, but it's without oversight, we can arrive at a good conclusion. And from that, in those studies, in the studies that we've done, we then started seeing how that manifests within the left. And one of the ways in which it does, when looking through foreign policy, is by understanding the two different aspects of conservatism, paleo and neoconservatism. So at this point, I know I'm rushing through a summary, but it will all make sense as I bring it together. So when we look at conservatism, and we see that there's two different worldviews within conservatism in America, around the world, and how they relate to other nations. This can be brought to view how they relate to individuals in their own country, but it's more explicitly seen in how they relate to foreign policy. Your paleo conservatives being those that adopt an isolationist worldview, and your neo conservatives, the ones that adopt an interventionist worldview. And we went into how that differs with the far left and their fear of their desire for a multipolar world and their fear of colonialism. So it's at this point that I hope that people finish reading that article that we went through last night about singling out Israel, a perspective from the left, because we went through all of that to see the outcome of looking at the world through a singular lens of colonialism and imperialism as being the sole distinguishing ill of the Western world. And in that article, I would just like to read one paragraph, if you'd allow me, where the author states explicitly what goes wrong when you do that, when you look at the world through the West's sole ill as being colonialism. So the preamble to this paragraph is the author detailing the history around Palestine and Israel, and the Jewish flight from Europe into the land in which they occupy today, running away from anti-Semitism. We all know that backdrop because we read it yesterday. But this paragraph states that this was a war of independence for the small population of Jewish refugees fleeing European anti-Semitism and the gas chamber. One aspect. And it was a catastrophe for the indigenous population who were ethnically cleansed from their land by Zionist militias and sent into the gray zone of permanent refugeehood. Both of these conflicting narratives are correct. When we look at events, it's easy to see them through just one perspective, because of agendas, because of points that need to be made. But this author is pointing out that in this story, at least in this aspect, this conflict between Israel and Palestine, two perspectives can be true at the same time, depending on, again, what point needs to be made. But rather than risk getting bogged down in morally complex considerations of the rights and wrongs of the conflict's origins, each side and their respective supporters, often with an eye of the politics of the moment, prefer to entrench themselves behind the safe walls of nationalist rhetoric and victimhood. This has made discussion of the Palestine-Israel conflict viciously polarized, because each side is looking at it through one lens and not considering, we'll say, the big picture or the full story. This is the bit that I wanted to come to. It's under the paragraph titled "The Left, the West, and One-Dimensional Anti-Imperialism." So in those examples that we gave of the Gray Zone and Max Blumenthal and all those actors being symbols of the ideology that pervades left-wing thinking in general, is this desire for a multipolar world where America doesn't get to be the imperialist state that they view it as. It doesn't get to be the country that gets to intervene in world affairs. Those world affairs should be dealt with by those local countries. I won't read all of that paragraph, but I'll pick up key sentences. As was noted above, the answer lies in Western imperialism and white settler colonialism. So that's the big fear behind, we'll say, elements of the left wing. It's that the West is just building an empire around the world, and the fear of white settlers colonizing everywhere. But a question remains, why is it that these related phenomena are so central to left-wing politics? There are, of course, examples of oppression, and so many democratic movements worthy of name should resist them. So the author is acknowledging that oppression does occur, and we should be able to point it out. But why do they often take precedence over other forms of subjugation, such as authoritarianism, theocracy, or patriarchy, to name only a few, that are frequently overlooked or downplayed by the anti-imperialist left? The answer lies in third worldism and the versions of it that have become prominent in progressive circles, etc., etc. And I would encourage you to carry on reading through these paragraphs to see how this one-dimensional way of looking at the world often blinds those that look at events to other things that do take place. Another article, if I can share my screen, and we won't read it, but I'd just like you to see it.
Curtis, you've got an
Hi,
hour.
Sigri. Okay, thanks, Sigri. This article was published in 2017, so it's a bit out of date, but still relevant. So the author starts off by pointing out that there was, can you see my screen first of all? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So at the time, 2017, there was a marathon that took place in Gaza, and Hamas essentially banned women from taking place entirely. And so there's two things that take place as a result. The first is that your pro-Israel hawks, so those Americans who are backing Israel, lambast the Islamist group, so Hamas, without considering the way in which Israel and America's foreign policy of isolating Gaza makes it easier for Hamas to practice the very misogyny these hawks rightly condemn. The second aspect is that the anti-Zionist left end up not saying anything at all. And it's easy for us to explain the pro-Israel perspective as a lot of the right fall under that blanket. But it's an article of faith on the American and Israeli right that once Israel dismantled its settlements in Gaza, it's discharged all responsibility for the place. I just want to go down to this paragraph. The far left doesn't have the problems mentioned in the preceding paragraph. Anti-Zionists rarely discuss Gaza without foregrounding Israel's partial blockade or what they have called the siege. That's their focus. It's the siege in Gaza. Rightly or wrongly, that's their focus. In so doing, they give Hamas an almost total pass. On March 6th, the anti-Zionist, in 2017, the anti-Zionist website, Mondowace, linked without comment to an article about the marathon as the 33rd story in its daily rundown of Israel-Palestine news. When they searched for the article, the author was directed to an entirely different story that pointed out that athletes were abused by Israeli soldiers for carrying a Palestine flag. So no mention of the women's rights being taken away, essentially. And every blog seems to miss this. But spend enough time reading anti-Zionist left and you notice a pattern. It's a continual retaliation against Israel. So no mention of, I won't go through the rest of the article, but there's no mention of the rights of women being affected within by Hamas. I'm just sharing my screen again. All I wanted to take from those two articles, and the third, which you may have come across, is the one done by the human rights, the head of human rights. It's called "Do Not Tell Me Human Rights Are Not Universal." Essentially, he points out that a lot of critique is leveled at the UN and the West in general for wanting to export human rights around the world. And the retaliation is that who are you to export your worldview around the world? All of that is to say that within the left, with a focus, when you end up focusing and looking at events through one specific perspective, you get blind spots to misogyny. You have blind spots to sexism that occurs. And I think the most visible place that we can see that is with an article that was shared about the sexual assaults against Israeli victims on the October 7 attack, and the reluctance, or we'll say oversight, of left-wing media, and critiques were leveled against the UN, of calling that out. And it took a long time for them to call that out. because focus was on the Palestinian lives that were being lost, which is true. But as I said, the reluctance to call out the oppression of women's rights is what ends up happening when you look at the world through one lens. And that occurred with Germany, or does occur with Germany in their relationship to the USSR. Alder Tess quoted or read through an article that spoke of the ties between Germany and Russia, and Germany's reluctance and difficulty to criticize in the Cold War the Red Army or Soviet Union repression because of their given history. But there's a sentence that she says in that presentation is that it makes Germany blind to the black side of the Soviet Union. So in all of this, in pointing out the colonialism and being anti-imperialist, it makes the left blind to the black side of terrorist organizations, namely Hamas. So while one thing may be true, that Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, is oppression, we and the left cannot get to a point where we ignore the failings or ignore the attacks done by Hamas against women and the sexual assaults that took place on October 7th. And I appreciate that in a different world solutions are resolved through dialogue. That's how the UN is set up, that we sit down and we discuss resolutions, and then once those are passed. But what happens when dialogue is not an option, and when your likes of Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden are going to fund a government or intervene in a situation militarily to overturn a government, such as the case was with Gaddafi, or in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, or now when Hillary Clinton stands up and she says that this war cannot end without a ceasefire. Hamas cannot be left to lead the Palestinians. There's a recognition that while one thing may be true in that Israel's occupation of Palestine is wrong morally, there's another story that keeps on getting forgotten, and that is the story of women's lives under Hamas control and the attacks on October 7th. So I've kind of rushed through those studies that were done by Alder Tess in Vespers, but the key points that were brought up in those studies is, one, understanding how equality and freedom come together and what's given priority in an individual's life or in a society's life. Two, that in the world, it's a culture war as well as a religious war, as society's minds are influenced and manipulated into believing a specific worldview. And three, at least when we look at foreign policy, how does the left come to the same conclusions as the far right? Through different bases, how do they get to that point, and why do they get to that point? It's through being blind and willfully ignoring other systems of oppression. In our case, specifically, women's rights oppression. So on June 24, 2022, Alder Tess goes through all of this, and in that she shares this article that we went through, singling out Israel, a perspective from the left, which points out the blind spots of the left, the ignorance of the left in identifying oppression as it relates to women's rights. On the same day, externally, as I'm sure most of us are aware, Roe v. Wade was overturned on June 24, 2022. So internally, we have this summary given of what has been understood or studied for the last 4 months or so. revolving around, I'm going to say, individualism and society, the individual and the group. So there's this summary study of individualism and how it manifests in foreign policy, as well as how it manifests in internal policy within America and around the world. And externally, Roe v. Wade is overturned. And when we look at the overturning of Roe v. Wade and you ask the question, why was it overturned? Do we see it as a religious issue or do we see it as a cultural issue? And I think that we can all come to the conclusion that we have to see it as both, because who is this fight being propagated by? It's easy to see it being propagated by the right-wing evangelicals, but it's less easy, but we do recognize that it's also being propagated by just the culture of the nation and how they view the issue of Roe v. Wade. And there's statistics about the support behind abortion in America. And at least off the top of my mind, if I can remember correctly, most people support a woman's choice with regards to women's abortion. So why did it get overturned if most of the individuals in the country support women's right to choose? And it's because of the political nature of America specifically, and the complacency of the left in the years leading up to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So the level of accusation we have to lay is on the foot of the left, or your liberals, and the complacency and lack of political action to carry on change after the 1960s. In my mind, at least, after all those rights were won, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, and after that period of history, the left goes into a slumber with regards to their political activism. And the right takes that weapon up, as we recognize in those studies of the moral majority, 1989, and Mitch McConnell, and the power that's given to the right wing to act politically. So I'm going to suggest that in sifting out and weeding out, we'll say, the bad elements of the left wing and seeing how they get to a point, we'll say externally within America, of letting Roe v. Wade be overturned, the fault, sure, we can put at the feet of right wing, but that fault can also be laid at the complacency of the left to incorrectly identify what major issues are in the prophetic nature. They have no compass to direct them prophetically, but internally, that's what we learn, and externally, that's what's fulfilled, at least. The inability of the left to act on women's issues in a way that gives power to the cause. And so it's from that suggestion or that perspective that when we come back here and try to look at this dispensation and see what is being addressed and who is that addressing, it's my suggestion that this increase of knowledge is going to be those two things. It's this identification of how equality and freedom relate to each other. And when you see that and you recognize that, how does that reflect on the failings of the left to act in a political manner with regards to Roe v. Wade? And the date that I would attach to that is the 24th of June, 2024.
Curtis,
That being said, go on, Natalie.
when you say politically, you're on about religiously?
I'm saying politically.
Okay.
So
not religiously, not Christianity.
Yeah, I'm saying politically. So we can easily see how the Republican Party was invigorated and had a plan to overturn Roe v. Wade. We'll say stretching back to, I'm just going to point to a major waymark, 1989, and the various actions that were undertaken by the Republican Party, by Mitch McConnell, by Clarence Thomas, by whoever you want to name in that journey, to finally get to the point where Roe v. Wade is overturned. And one of the failures of the left is codifying Roe v. Wade in that story, because of the belief that we've won these rights from 1973, from Civil Rights Act. Along the way, it's just, we'll say, compromise from the left time and time again, to not seeing how fragile it was in its current state, so to speak. So that's why I'm saying it's this political battle between the left and the right. And of course, amongst that, you can point to the religious reasons or the cultural reasons, but I'm just looking at the political nature of this fight. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
And you're tying it up to what's going on in Hamas, because going on with Hamas in Gaza, you're not, and that's why you put them political here, because they're not, the right, the far left and the far right, they're not seeing the gender issue, the violence, the aggression.
I just used the issue of Israel and Palestine and Hamas as kind of like a witness to point out that the left are not seeing or are unwilling to call out this behavior. So I'm not tying it to this waymark. The two things that I'm tying to this waymark are Roe v. Wade being overturned, and at least the increase of knowledge being about how an individual relates to society and how society relates to the individual.
Thanks.
With equality and freedom.
Because you've got 2024, 2022.
My bad. Mm-hmm. And so the question remains, okay, if that is the increase of knowledge, I have 10 minutes. Let's see what I can do in 10 minutes. If that is the increase of knowledge, what would formalize that message? And it could be, now I'm not going to suggest a date or a study for this. I'm going to open a question, at least, as to how we would think about what that is. And then perhaps we can come to an answer in another study. Is, if we remember that in this time period between Panem and the Sunday Law, these two waymarks relate to the sifting of Levites and Nethinims, or should relate to the sifting of Levites and Nethinims, and how they see external events, and the inability to see women's issues, or at least patriarchy is given a second-class citizenship ranking in world affairs or oppression, so to speak. And it's this tunnel vision that blinds to other oppression. The example that I gave was tunnel vision with respects to colonialism. Option one, if I can put it this way, is on October 7, the story or the news that I've been relaying either solidifies that understanding of the failures of the left to correctly identify things with regards to women's rights. Does one thing blind them to another, or should they be able to see what is happening prophetically that lead you up to the Sunday Law? And then internally, the understanding that for us as a movement, there's this conflict or this tension between the individual as part of a movement and the group. And I won't go into the details of that, but if you would like to watch Aldo Paminda's presentation on October the 20th, it fleshes that out, this antagonism between the individual and the group. But I would suggest that would not be the formalization. It's just part of the story of this increase of knowledge, of learning more about how the individual relates to the group and the weaknesses of the left and their blind spots and etc. Why I suggest that is if we can turn our eyes to the election cycle. So I will try and do this quickly, but please stop if you have questions because the board work or the artwork may not make a lot of sense. If we go through each of the elections, these are election years. So not when a president was inaugurated, but when the vote took place and when America finds out who won. And we know that there's a period of time between where that transition of power up until sometime in January when it's formalized. So going through those election years, in 1988, when George Bush Sr. won, and each of these dates, if we look at them, we can see that none of them align with major waymarks. When we look at what those major waymarks are on the line of the priests, that's this bottom line over here. The major waymarks are 1989, 2001, 2014, 2019, 2021. And none of those election years fall on, we'll say, the 5 key waymarks. And the same is said on the line of the Levites and Nethinims. None of their major waymarks fall on election years. Instead, what you see is that at certain points, election years fall on either formalizations or increases of knowledge. So in 1996, that election year for Bill Clinton was the formalization on the line of the priests. In 2012, when Obama won the election, the Democrats won the election, that was the formalization in 2012 on the line of the priests. And in 2020, again, when Biden won, that was the increase of knowledge on the line of the priests. That's all to say that in this election cycle, every 4 years, historically at least, it's never fallen on a major waymark. Why I think that's significant is because when we think of a dispensation, as I'm just going to put it arbitrarily, as a message arrives, there's an increase of knowledge of that message, then it's formalized, and then test. Is that for anything at this point of a formalization to be held accountable to when this message does arrive, there needs to be a party or a person or a group in place to enact something that would befall a testing at a major waymark. So for instance, in 2014, the Sunday law for the priests, that couldn't occur in this time period of a transition of power because there had to be someone in power, whether it's the executive branch that's leading that out, or the judicial or the legislative. a government has to be in place that has power to be able to do something. So in 2024, when we have an election, my suggestion is that doesn't fall on a major waymark. Instead, that would fall on a waymark that sets up the stage for a major waymark to take place. If it's not 2024, then 2028. But it's just identifying that here, the suggestion is that this does not fall on a major waymark. And instead, the question should be what sets up or what comes into place to set up a major waymark. For them, it would be what is established to set up the second advent and what is established to set up a close of probation on the line of the Levites and the Nethinims. So a lot of assumptions made, at least when we skimmed through some of these things that were done in those Vesper studies, but that was because of time. But a lot of those details, I'll come back to you, Natalie, were covered in past Vesper studies by her, and then between ourselves when we did those Vesper studies. So I didn't go into them in a lot of detail. Yes, Natalie, your question?
I'm not got no issues with what you're saying, but just that, can we just confirm that formalization is a test and the big waymark is the result of your test?
Yeah.
Okay.
One leads on to the other.
Curtis, you said 2028 a moment ago.
Mm-hmm.
What was that in relation to?
I just said whether it is 2024 or 2028, it doesn't fall on a major waymark.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Was making that suggestion, at least. Okay. And now, to go back to the question that my dad asked at the beginning, because I still have 2 minutes, which was, what does all this matter? Why does all this matter when we're just bystanders in the unfolding events? So I assume, you can clarify if this is what you meant, we within the movement are just looking at external events unfolding, and the suggestion is that we're not taking our understanding of prophecy publicly. I guess it's a question of what does all this do for us? What does understanding prophetic events do for us? And I think there's 2 ways in which I can answer that question, which is the typical answer that we give, the standard, looking at waymarks brings you closer to the second advent. They help you guide your story. But the second is that I think that more so than that is when external events attached to waymarks take place and we are correctly able to identify the key issues within a myriad of other issues, is identifying that sole issue that is bringing you to the Sunday law, we in turn become changed. So this whole story is about how we are changed as a people, collectively and individually. And so that's one aspect in my answer to your question. What is the point of all this? It's to change us. It's to change our worldview as we're refined along the way to get to the point that God wants us to be. And then the second is, okay, that's us, but what about the world? And I don't have a fully structured answer to that. I think that there's an aspect of them changing as well, but as we, at a parabolic level, as we can appreciate that there's 2 reasons why the Levites and the Nethinims cannot be saved without joining this movement. And it comes down to the same thing in the end. One is how we, and these 2 are symbols of broader issues. I'm just going to tie them together. One is equality and one is the Sabbath. So if we look at the Levites at a general level, Levites being your Adventists, where do they stand on the Sabbath? We'll say Adventist doctrine. We disagree on a lot of details, but if we can just say at a superficial level, they accept the Sabbath. Where we disagree with them is on human rights as it relates to God's people and the church. And so the flip question is, okay, at a superficial level with Nethinims, where do we see eye to eye? We'll say good Levites and good Nethinims. Where do we see eye to eye? It's on issues relating to equality. Where do we disagree? It's on our doctrine as a group of believers. These two are I've simplified what is composed of those two things, but they're teaching the same thing, which I'm suggesting is how does an individual relate to their society? My understanding is that God is not trying to raise or create individuals that can live in isolation, is that God is trying to create a people who live within a society. And the Sabbath and equality do that for you and do that for the group. There was a hand that went up. Yeah.
If you finished your point.
For now, yeah.
So the question that Brian asked is, what's the point of all of this? And I think your answer was, well, the obvious point is it benefits us. Mm-hmm. So I think we could all agree with that. And I'm hoping that Brian could agree with that answer. And then the second point is you candidly said, I've got no idea what it does for the world. I know you maybe didn't say it in such strong terms, but you ventured to say you can't answer that question because it's not clear. I wanted to offer a third possibility. Often when we talk about the great controversy, because we're earthbound, we think everything revolves around us. And because we think that, or we have this idea that sin never permeated the universe and it's only contained, say, in our solar system, whatever that means, everything else is secure. I'd just like to offer a suggestion without giving any proof that I don't think that's the case. I think that if I just call it the onlooking universe, to borrow a phrase that Ellen White uses, their salvation is not secure. Their understanding of right and wrong is not fixed, it's not firm, and therefore is, I'm going to say, not correct, or at least open to further development. And as we learn what the purpose for creation is in the outplay of the controversy that's going on Earth, those people that are observing, they're also participating in the same way we do. And I want to suggest that there's no way for those people, the onlookers in the universe, even the angels, there's no way for them to understand what equality is, how it operates, how it works, until we, I'll just say the 144,000 on this planet, work it out. Until we get to the place that we work out how this operates, and that's done by our participation and our observation, which means our commentary, they don't actually understand how it works either, which means their salvation isn't secure. And so this isn't about us, the Levites and the Nethinims. If we're willing to accede to I don't want to call it the fact, but the assumption that the Levites and Nethinims, the 7 billion people on this planet, are collateral damage. If we're willing to accede to that proposition, there's a whole universe to be saved. And that universe cannot be saved without us decoding the message. And I know that people may find that reasonably acceptable, but what they probably won't find acceptable also is that perhaps God still is not clear is still working out what equality looks like and how it operates both religiously and politically. And politically, I mean in God's kingdom, how it actually operates, how it functions. And I think, or I want to suggest, that that can only be understood and worked out by everybody. The 144, the angels, the onlooking universe, and God themselves, only as it gets fulfilled. That there is no standard answer at the end of this, that God had, oh, my plan all worked out and I knew how it was all going to look like. I think this all actually happens in real time, and the end result isn't fixed. And that's one of the reasons why I think we don't understand what heaven will look like, because I don't think the answer's already there. The way the answer will only be created by the experience that we all go through, and I don't think it's a fixed path. Our behavior changes the end result. The end result, in a generic term, will say is good. Heaven is good. But what that good actually ends up looking like, I don't think is fixed and firm. And therefore, it's not just about the Levites and the Nethinim, then, oh, God forbid, they're all going to die, and what's all the point of that? There's a bigger issue. It's about God's security, the angel security, and the universe's security. And all of their security hinges upon our behavior, and more than our behavior, our understanding of what's going on. And that, to me, is why this is so important. It's not about the other human beings on this planet. If they live or die, so be it. There's a bigger issue at hand. And I think sometimes we lose that perspective. And I think we've lost it since 2018. When we think about humanity and human nature, I think we've got to a place that we think everything is about us. And I don't think it is. It's as much about human beings as it is about angels, as about beings, as it is for God. And I think God is actually learning too. And it's a concept I think we feel very uncomfortable about and intuitively wrong. So I'm not trying to insist upon that in the same way that I would talk perhaps stronger about the other people in the universe that require our understanding in order to be saved, because they don't know the answer to the questions. The only way they get those answers is by us finding them. And that's not a new message. That's an old message that this movement has had for a long time, that everybody in the universe works it out when we work it out. And Elder Tess, I think, has done studies on this as well, that Satan doesn't know the game plan. If I can call it a him or they, I don't like using they for Satan, it sounds too respectful. It is working out the plan as it goes along, and it doesn't know the answers to things until we work it out. And I think that works for not only the rest of the universe, I think it works to some degree with respect to God as well. And that's what I think is the answer to Brian's question. It's not about Levites and Nethinims. I'm done.
Hello. Can I just
I think because the question was related to Brian, I'll let you speak and then I'll go to Natalie.
Yeah, I just want to, that's very insightful what Elder Paminda was just saying, and it's brought a new dimension into how I was looking at this whole thing, that this is just not about us, but it's about the universe. But also I'd like to ask then, I thought the great controversy was an earth story, because all this happened earthlings, and the rest of the universe were not evolved in sin. So you've opened it up to say the whole universe is watching and learning. But how are they learning something that's not in their sphere? They haven't witnessed this issue on equality. They're living, I take it, quite comfortably and happy with whatever they're doing. We don't know. But yeah, And I like the concept of collateral damage, that the rest of Earthlings will just be collateral damage. Yeah, but my main question there, Elder P, is that the great controversy was with Earthlings. Not the universe.
I don't know if you wanted to respond to that.
I think Natalie wanted to say something there as well.
Can you go for it?
So I don't want to distract from the study, because I think it was a really, really good study. But the answer to your question, Brian, I think it's so most of those answers are already built into the spirit of prophecy. When we go to heaven, the part of the work of the 144,000 has only just begun in heaven. We know that we go around the universe on mission trips, teaching them, etc. What are we teaching them? What are we instructing them on? And one of the things in the Garden of Eden, it says, you should be as gods, knowing good and evil. And we have a basic understanding that that knowing isn't an intellectual assent to the truth, and it's an experiential one. And part of our work, even though it's all focused around the earth, this controversy, for sure it is, but even after it's all done and dusted and the second advent's done and we're all in heaven, those people around the universe will not be gods in the same way that we will be gods, because we will have had an experiential life of knowing what it means to be God in a way that they never have. They have never made judgment calls, they never needed to, about life and death issues, because they're not confronted with sin. They don't have to kill people like we do. And killing is hating or lying or whatever facet of that is. They don't have that experience. And that's why we are gods and they're not. That's why we sit on the throne and they don't. There's a whole depth of understanding that I don't claim to have about how invasive and pervasive the great controversy is. And even though it's bound to earth, we're just the play, but it has affected those people. And even though we just think they're observers, they're participants in this as much as we are, in their own way. And if we got it wrong, if the 144,000 mess up, whether or not we say that's even possible or not, but if we did, their salvation gets called into question and they'll end up sinning. Their salvation can't be held secure, because it then challenges the rights and wrongs of God, and they'll end up questioning, critiquing, and making decisions because of their free will that will spiral them into sin.
If what? Sorry.
If we don't make the right choices, if we don't come to the right conclusion, if we don't work out these answers, we don't get it straight ourselves about how and what equality is all about, what the golden rule is, eventually they will end up doing sin. It all hinges upon us. It's not just a matter of containment. It's about it's all dependent upon us. So when I'm responding to the question that Brian said, I thought it was all about what's going on in this earth and the sin problem here. The sin problem hasn't occurred elsewhere, but it will do.
If we don't get it right.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Natalie, you wanted to say something?
I don't know how to say it now, but we say then that the 144,000 down here, there's a movie going on, and if the movie's not shown till the end, that heaven doesn't know what quality looks like, and actually it wasn't even equality in the beginning anyway with God in heaven and Satan and Jesus. Just was there equality in heaven anyway in the beginning? Because Eden to Eden, that Elf test gave us, is about an earthly thing, isn't it? Or not? Anyway, I don't want to take away, I don't want to dwell on that, because what Elder Brenda said is quite deep and we should meditate upon that.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for your contributions. I apologize for rushing through a large portion of the middle bit, but if at another point, maybe at Vespers in the future, we can go into a bit more detail about some of the thoughts I shared, then that will be the case. But for now, I hope that things made a bit of sense, at least what I was trying to put across. So let's close in a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you continually for illuminating our paths, to understand what is taking place. With many things happening at once, it can sometimes be difficult to zoom in on the things that lead us to the Sunday law, while acknowledging that there's many things that grab our attention. There are specific things that historically we've tied to waymarks where other things haven't been. So it's my prayer that you may continue to give us those prophetic glasses to be able to identify the things that do bring us to a point of a Sunday law being passed in America. Pray that you may be with us through the rest of the Sabbath, be with us in our studies as I tried to answer questions for myself, as we all tried to answer questions for ourselves in the midst of the great controversy and what that means to us and for the rest of your creation. Please continue to strengthen us in this journey, and please bless the rest of the Sabbath. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.